Hey everybody, welcome to IT Operations Unplugged. Delighted to be back with you here again for this special episode as a reaction to the previous episode where we talked about ERP islands. Joined once again, as always, by my co-host, John Appleby. Time for your wave, John. And absolutely delighted to be joined by a first-time guest, Neil Howe, founder and CEO of Limelight Consulting. So fantastic to have you on here. And thanks so much for joining us. It's brilliant to have you here.
Yeah, lovely to be here.
Brilliant. This concept of a reaction show, Brenton. It's like reality
I know.
TV.
It also means that what we're talking about is vaguely interesting, or so some people seem to think. But we won't go there. So a brief recap of kind of what we discussed the last time. So this was last time we really focused on the concept of the islands of SAP, islands of ERP, whatever you want to call it, within the enterprise. And is the era of SAP operating in its silo, separate to the rest of the company, separate ITSM systems? Is that going to continue? Who's at fault for causing it in the first place? And what is the future in this space, or are we doomed to continue in what we've seen before? That's kind of the background for this. And I kind of feel like there was a conversation starting between the two of you on Twitter. And Neil, I'm going to jump to you first, if that's all right, because I think you had an interesting perspective on John's piece, which kind of kicked all this off.
Yeah, it was a great piece, don't get me wrong. And I wasn't sort of stirring the hornet's nest, I suppose, from that perspective. I kind of largely agree. And I think the challenge, I think, that I sort of become aware of, I suppose, really, is we spoke previously, or you spoke previously, about the fact that there's still these islands and they still exist in the quite common place in the businesses. But I would argue maybe that the modern deployments of an ERP solution, so those that have gone live in the last 5 years, you'd hope, let's say, they've learned their mistakes of the past, and certainly the ones that we've been involved in. And it comes back to a little bit about the responsibilities of the SI in this
right
as well, and how, quite frankly, it's the easy route for the SI to drop in an island, because and that's probably where I'd argue the legacy of this has come from. It very much is the case that if you look at some of the older clients and things, the SIs are ultimately there. They're helping the implementation of the program, whatever it might be. They put in all these clever processes and change controls and all these other governance models, as you'd expect. Well, you hope they will, and then obviously they then leave, and they are. And the problem they have is I sort of sympathise with them to a degree, is that they get to the end of their program, it's about to go live, and the last thing they want to do is to transition out of their operating model.
Absolutely.
And actually, the easiest thing for them to do is just leave it as it is. And if the client doesn't mind too much and it kind of works, I'm kind of assuming that it's going to get left. And it's poor form, quite frankly, I suppose, from the SI, because they are leaving a problem, and it's a big problem, because once those processes get embedded, you're going to struggle to get out of them, quite frankly. And it's incumbent on the SI to kind of move the organization from a support arm forwards, and that kind of really doesn't happen, really. But I say, in the last sort of 3, 4, 5 years, I'd probably argue that a little bit that they've got better at this, and they've started to get more wise to the kind of enterprise-wide operations and all those other types of things. But it certainly leaves the SI sort of, there's a few questions, I guess, really about the responsibilities of the SI in this, definitely.
And I'm in complete agreement with most of what you said, actually. And it's that legacy, isn't it, that they're leaving behind? It's a legacy of overheads. It's a legacy of cost, because you're going to, if you start with the island and you accept the island at the point of go live, then you're going to be dealing with the cost of that island for a very long time, because changing it retrospectively is very difficult. And I wonder if anybody has done any analysis on the true cost of allowing those islands to continue as islands, and not integrate them, or not insist that they be integrated at the point of go live. John, any thoughts from your side?
Yeah, I think these are all different ways of looking at the elephant. I think what might be, Neil, it'd be great to understand where your perspective comes from. So what is your business, and what sorts of, so you're an implementer, right? We were all implementers, by the way, at some point in our life.
So this company we set up was, it sits in the gap between the SI and the client. So we kind of drop in place kind of, let's say, leadership management structures on a client's behalf to manage the SI and to deal with the SI and their implementation. So our kind of goal really is lead the implementation, get the client business ready and technologically ready to receive the work from the SI, and then robustly manage the SI through the process. Because everybody forgets that the SI really is just a supplier, and you've got to manage a supplier. So you wouldn't let them just run off. So we kind of come in and sort of lead these things from a client perspective. We drop in a team rather than a bunch of individuals that clearly they've worked together before, and all those other types of good things as well. And it's really interesting from our perspective because we kind of see the SI's laziness, I suppose, from that angle, and then are responsible for them wrestling it around and correcting it and integrating it properly with the IT estate, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And
what's the target customer? What's the profile?
Pretty much anybody in the kind of FTSE 500 upwards, really. So we tend to work with the bigger implementations, pretty much because they're the people that need the help the most, because their business transformation is the hardest, and they typically don't have that particular experience themselves. And
they can afford the client side work as well in this case.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, the risk of not having it is potentially worth the value of having it. So.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, exactly that.
Cool, got it. That makes sense. And so, this kind of concept of an ERP island, I suppose it was more steeped from the other perspective as well, which is what's the average age of an ERP system? I actually don't know the answer to that, but I'm going to go with 15 years because most, and then what are the operating models that have been left over from since R3 was implemented in 1991. 30 odd years ago until now, and how much did that really change in the average organization? Whereas I think when you have a customer that's implementing now, there is a tendency to at least try and apply modern concepts to DevOps and IT Ops. Whether they're always successful, I don't know. I think the average customer is really, really varied. I'm not sure there is an average customer. I always talk about, what Microsoft are doing as being, really kind of revolutionary, how they approach DevOps. But I also know that, some of the customers running on Google Cloud are the same. They have their project landscapes set up within minutes. I was on the Google call last week and they were talking, one of their customers was talking about how, they can get a new project landscape set up in under 5 minutes. I mean, it's kind of incredible. And then you've got right the other end of the spectrum, and especially those customers that are running on SAP's HANA Enterprise Cloud. The SLA for a project landscape is 3 to 4 weeks. So, it's so varied what is out there.
Yeah, I agree, and I think I feel sorry for anybody who's kind of in the IT leadership roles at the minute, because there is so much movement, if you like, amongst all the parts, and it's really difficult, I think, in their position. I mean, they've gone through a year of hell, quite frankly, as well, which hasn't helped the matter. But
go through it continues.
Well,
right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you'd like to hope they'll come out of it a little bit, but absolutely, still moving through it. But I think part of it is the SI themselves, and this applies to anybody who's still involved in a what we call a legacy account, I suppose. Really, the SI themselves are almost incumbent on, and it's a catch-22, because the SI will not want to do this, but they're incumbent, so they should be trying to make themselves redundant, because that's the only way they're going to improve the enterprise, and no SI is going to want to do that.
Although I would argue they are probably all claiming that's the whole premise of their service offering, is to make themselves redundant. But I agree with you; they're not going to want to. It's their bread and butter. And is that part of the problem? Is that part of the problem, that we're looking at an industry that understands that if they embrace this, then they will be causing not the end, but at least a massive downturn in demand for those services? Is that the case?
Yeah, possibly so. But that's not a. If somebody came to me and said, I'm going to reduce your cost of ownership, let's say from 60% over the next 3 years, and this is how I'm going to do it, and we don't know all the technologies that are going to be available yet, but this is kind of the concepts we're talking about, and they started to make traction along that, if I was a CIO or a CTO, whichever role, and I'd probably go, do you know what? That's a great supplier. Like, they are helping me run my business better.
Agreed.
And I'm probably more likely to use them for something different in the future, because they're showing that initiative of actually putting the client at the center rather than their margin at the center, which is the crux of it, really, I think.
Does anyone want to have a guess? So the top 10 managed services providers, does anyone have a guess how many SAP basis employees they've got between them?
Good question. I wouldn't even know where to start.
Go on, Brenton. You have a guess. You're willing to put stuff out there.
So repeat the question. So the top 10 service providers, how many SAP basis engineers do they have?
Yep.
250,000? I'm going high. No, it's not.
No.
150,000?
No, you're not close. It's not that bad. 7,100.
Okay, that's a lot lower than I thought.
It's a ton of people. But by the way, by comparison, their practices are about 10 times that. So it's about 71,000 in the top 10. And remember, this is a very, very long tail. Our estimate of the number of SAP consultants out there is something like in operation, something like 124,000, something like that.
How does that play into this, John? Why did you reach for that as the leading?
Well, I was just thinking. So when you've got to feed 71,000 mouths, or 7,000 mouths, that is, how do you get incentivized to get those people off billable work?
Off billable work or onto different billable work, which I think is the point you were making, Neil, which is that if you're able to, reduce that TCO, make yourself redundant, you will probably end up being a better partner, getting more work, and so doing different things, possibly more strategic things for that customer. Maybe that's the answer, or maybe that's a bit optimistic. I'm not sure.
I think when you got that many people, it's tough.
Don't disagree.
No, I agree. But I do think there'll be a shift as well. I think there'll be a shift in skill sets, because the basis technology is it's a dark art to many, I suppose, isn't it? It's something that people just don't really even understand, and it's quite hard sometimes to justify the cost of that particular element, because you can't even sometimes explain it very well, especially to executives. And it might be that what happens is, if your SI came to you and said, look, we're going to deploy this technology instead, and this technology is going to potentially replace 3 of our team, and what we're going to do is repurpose those 3 and look at this new thing over here and make this widget over here shinier. I think that would probably be more well received, because you kind of need to show the innovation in the space, and that's what we're kind of not really seeing, I guess, is that kind of SI-driven innovation, because quite frankly, a CIO and a CTO is going to be too busy to sit and watch tech ed and try and understand what the hell's going on. So somebody needs to come to these guys and say, look, we can do X, Y, and Z differently. This can be automated. That can be automated. We'll take that problem away from you. You can probably move these people from over here to here. And why don't we look at this? And it's about packaging that up in a nice value perspective, isn't it?
And what I've seen that really works is when you create a contract with a service provider to have an inbuilt cost reduction year on year, inbuilt headcount reduction, and inbuilt requirement to introduce software-driven innovation. I think when you do that, it gets really interesting. But you're talking about contract levers in contracts that are as big as 8 billion euros is one that was signed this year. And
huge number.
It's difficult, right?
But I think it'd be a welcome change. Like if I don't know anybody that, and I'd probably maybe speak to, 5, 6 CIOs, maybe a week or so, just in the course of my week. And it would be a refreshing change, I think, for them to go to me, RSI came to me and said, what about all this stuff? What do you think? And you could go quite happily, that's a great idea. You should be absolutely looking at that. We should be looking at AI, or you should be looking at whatever it might be. Because the problem is that the longer it stands still, the worse the problem gets. And it's this whole kind of, you've got to continually move, you've got to continually push forwards. And if you don't, you're just going to, the size of the island will just get bigger and bigger and bigger as SAP gets more complicated and puts more technology into its stack. So it's just a really tricky one for an SI. I can understand their problem. I can understand where their hesitation would be perhaps from that angle, but they are, but as you say, John, coming up with some kind of reduction contract is a really smart thing to do if you're in that kind of MSA type world.
I think the other thing that service providers, not customers, can do to help is to put it into the evaluation criteria. Is the service provider using technology innovation to drive down the cost, or are they just, I won't say the name of this company because it was a confidential conversation that would make them look really bad, but there's a company that does S4HANA analysis. So what's the work that was required to be done to move to S4? And he said, we have an automated product. He said, and it comes in and it does the analysis and produces a report. He said, don't tell anyone, but it's a bunch of people in India. So just package it up to look like a digital report. And he was proud of it as well. And not, one of the bigger companies, let's put it that way.
Yeah,
I think he's no longer in his role, incidentally, but that's
unrelated.
I don't know. It almost certainly is unrelated because the big SIs, they don't think of that as being a problem. They think of that as being a differentiator. To them, it was a differentiator from a commercial perspective. How it was delivered is secondary, but how it's delivered, it does matter regardless of the cost, because unless you're actually reducing the workload, in the end, you can't continue to squeeze margins.
No. You
can't. Absolutely not.
And one of the points I want to pick up on earlier, just to kind of round out this whole MSA piece and the contractual piece that you made earlier, Neil, I really liked it, was that even at the point of contract signature or negotiation, you may not know what the technologies are going to be that are going to solve the problems. So I think it's less about have they reduced the TCO or plan to reduce it based on the use of a specific technology, or is it have they illustrated the plan through which they intend to stay abreast of the new technologies that could help, and then adopt those with their client in order to achieve X, Y, and Z. I think it by its nature has to be open-ended. Otherwise, it becomes a tick box exercise. Do you use Ansible? Yes. Do you use blah? Yes. And you see, you want to drive and see more from them about how they're going to continue to keep you at the forefront of that stuff.
Definitely. And it also needs to be outside of the spectrum of SAP products as well. Completely. There's too many out there that are useful. SAP always claim, let's say, to have the best in their stack, but clearly there are better and more niche products, I should say, out there that have done this their whole lives.
And we should be looking to other islands or other areas of the business and saying, right, what are they doing that is so much better than what we're doing? And what can we learn from that? What can we take? I think that's got to be a big part of it. But I want to shift gears slightly, which is that if let's talk to the customers now that are in this situation. They know they have a problem. And they may or may not have an SI involved, or maybe the SI was only doing the original implementation and maybe they're running in-house. It doesn't really matter. Where do they start? What is the first step in reducing these islands and bridging whatever, insert marketing phrase here, which I'm sure marketing will come up with, but you get my point. How do they go on this journey of connecting the dots and starting to use some of this technology? What are your perspectives?
I think... first of all, I think recognizing the problem is a good start, because so many people don't recognize the problem, and actually, and then there is this need to show a need to transition, I guess, really, because it's going to, whatever you do is going to cost some kind of either time, money, people, whatever it might be. And quite often there's a lot of benchmarks out there that people can go to, because the problem is you go to a company and they'll say, oh yeah, we can reduce your total cost by 6 people, 2 people, 100,000, 200,000, whatever the numbers are. But the problem is nobody, with respect to anybody in the service industry, nobody really believes those numbers to the same degree. But what they do believe is benchmarks. And if you can find out what benchmark targets are for your particular areas, so you take the subjectivity out, take the technology out, and you come back with benchmark numbers, you could say, I don't know, my cost of, let's say the cost of making a small change request into an SAP system should be, by industry standard, I don't know, 5 days of time, and it might cost this much money or whatever.
Sure.
And if you can go back to your team and say, look, we're way off kilter here. We've got a 20-day lead time for this. It should be 5. We need to invest in some technology. Here's the return on it. And it's the return that's important, because people won't move without that return. There'll be no desire to move until that return is sort of seen and observed. And then I think then you're almost, as soon as that sort of catalyst has happened, you're kind of almost showing. If you're running an SAP system, I think, John, you mentioned it last time, 60% of most departments are just keeping their lights on, and then 40% of it goes on to innovation. But if you can move that needle, and if you can reduce that to 40% support or 30% support or whatever it might be, all of a sudden you can offer more to the business, and you've got more strategic options available to your business. You can move forward as a business. You can look at all sorts of weird and wonderful things you could never possibly do before within the same cost envelope. And it's just about kind of, you've got to build that case to change, I suppose, is the first thing. And you've got to get that buy-in from that top team, because otherwise it's going nowhere, because you just hit obstacle upon obstacle when trying to spend more money, quite frankly.
But there's an elephant in the room here, right? Because what you said is exactly right. But tell me, if you're running Salesforce, what percentage of your budget goes to keeping the lights on versus projects and innovation?
Oh, probably much smaller than SAP.
I mean, it's basically wrapped up into the SaaS contract, right? And by the way, I'm being a little into SAP because they've got plenty of products that fall into that category. They got SuccessFactors and Ariba and all of the other SaaS products. But this is an ERP specific problem. And I almost would say to CIOs, why don't you start with that benchmark? To start with the benchmark of your Google Cloud platform where you have your SREs. And benchmark what like best in class looks like, and now benchmark that against where you are for ERP today and where your investment portfolio, what the investment shape looks like, and then say, how do I move towards that direction? It's always going to be difficult with ERPs that essentially are on-premise software, even if you run them in a hyperscaler. You're always going to have an operations overhead, and part of that is that on-premise software, you're not paying SaaS costs, so that some of that money for Salesforce goes directly to the vendor. But at the same time, I think it'd be really useful that you just to start there. And then the second piece is, how much of that cost is because of duplication? You've got a second IT service management platform.
Yeah.
You've got most of these groups that do this and have a separate IT service management platform, they have a separate L1 support for SAP.
Yep.
It's another team of people.
Yep. Crazy. Yeah, I agree. Totally agree. But yeah, I think it's one of those things. Once you create the desire and once you create the door opening, I suppose, from that perspective, you're almost, I can't see anybody, no CFO is going to turn around and go, no, you can't investigate that cost, or you can't push that further forward.
Right.
Because you're clearly showing some progress, I suppose, really against the cost number that probably people struggle to swallow anyway, let's be frank, because nobody really knows what the return is on that, apart from it doesn't break. So it's a real tough one. But if you can, and this comes back to this whole kind of support as an innovation function, which is kind of where the sort of slightly more forward-thinking organizations have moved towards, and clearly have embraced that a little bit more than just literally keeping a lights-on entity in the background, I suppose, really.
Yeah. Completely. I think that makes a lot of sense. I really like I like pulling out the points that we've just been discussing, just to really highlight them. I really like the idea of the benchmarking, but equally I really like the best in class comparison, because I think that will be a kind of a whoa, what moment. That kind of, when you see that up on the screen, you say, look, yes, of course it's a SaaS platform, but look, compared to this, we can't be that bad, surely. I think that in itself will be enough to get people's attention, which is actually one of the biggest challenges, in my view, for getting started.
When you've seen best in class, it's difficult to think differently. So I was talking to a customer who was running on Google Cloud, and so they had some of the benefits we talked about being able to stand up project landscapes or auto scale and those sorts of things. And they were going out to tender, and that happened to one of the vendors had come in and tendered for virtual cloud services as well. And they said, yeah, sure, you can come and talk to us about that. They say, let's just go through a couple of things first. In your model, how long will it take us to to scale, because at certain periods of the month we've got peak demand and we need to be able to scale. How much notice do you need? 3 weeks. And they said, but we can do it in 2 minutes today. Why are we having this conversation? So once you've seen what best in class looks like, it's kind of really obvious. And so maybe Brenton, that's something for us, is to describe what does that actually look like. Maybe people don't know.
Yeah, I'd agree. And it is it's quite a hard thing to get hold of as well, actually, because there's no industry benchmark or industry publication that you could go to get that thing from.
Exactly.
Quite frankly, nobody really wants to put that out there, because actually they'd suddenly see there are a lot of holes in what they do.
Yeah. No, it opened my mind. It was the last business trip I did was last year. Wasn't the last business trip, one of the last ones. I was in Redmond. I always think Redmond, Virginia, but Redmond, Washington, the other Redmond. and the guys from Microsoft were describing how they do it, and they were describing how, obviously they were trying to look good, but it's because they really are that good. And maybe we just need to help people like that amplify, what it is they're doing. The example that they gave, which I thought was really, really powerful, was they were configuring, and I forget the details because it was a long time ago now, but they were trying to figure out how they were going to implement a central finance system. And there were probably 20 different ways to approach it, different options of approaches that they could take. And nobody knew which the right one to take would be. So what did they do? They spun up 20 environments, in parallel did the 20 different ways. And each time, and they didn't need 20, they probably needed 5, because they looked at the combinations of things they could do. And each time they went somewhere and they realized it was a dead end. They'd given the business the ability to roll back. So the finance people rolled back to the last point in time, continued. It took them 2 weeks to prototype all of the 20 different ways to do that with their DevOps tools.
Yeah.
And otherwise, you're talking about a 6-month blueprint project, which probably comes to the wrong answer.
Yes.
Probably,
At which point they realize it halfway through, and then they realize it's change request time and the whole direction changes. And suddenly it's not a 6-month project, it's a year-long project.
Well, and as with these things, that there are lots of shades of wrong. And
of course,
the difference between the optimal and suboptimal is normally code. So I think they were able to avoid code by using the best scenario for them. But there's literally no way for them to figure that out easily without doing a very detailed analysis or just trying it. But the fact that they put the DevOps tools in the hand of the actual functional people to do configuration, I thought was really interesting. That made a mistake, roll back just to 10 minutes ago, done. One click.
Fantastic.
Very clever, yeah.
So anyway,
A great success story.
Be interesting to know how many organizations could leverage that if given their technology stack that they have available to them. Because clearly Microsoft, Google, they've got the skills in-house, they've got the know-how, they've got the power, everything you could ever imagine at their disposal, haven't they, quite frankly? But
then you go back to the point we were making earlier on, where we're talking about the innovative SIs, the ones that really want to push the boat out on this. If you're a customer and you've engaged the right SI, they're already, or they should be thinking along these lines. And while they may not have the answers, they should have the internal R&D, or whatever you want to call it, want to drive that kind of innovation to help you as the end customer. So it kind of comes back to the selection of your SI again, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the SI is key. And I mean, at the end of the day, the SI is the advisory body, I suppose, really, you can go to, that you kind of hope is going to steer your ship the right way. And that they've got a vested interest clearly in profit, which is unfortunate, but they should be moving that ship accordingly to help you as the client, and that's where the value add is, and that's why you pay them over the odds, let's say, for the particular services they deliver.
I think it's just so difficult to have a forward-thinking perspective on that as a customer. I remember meeting with a CIO a few years ago now on a project I was doing, and he said, "We're happy to pay your rates." He said, "We're paying double what we would pay, one of our other partners." He said, "But we've paid half for the overall project costs, so that's a fair deal for everyone." I don't know how many people really think that way. I think people
looking
tend
at the bigger
to get
picture
down by day rates and number of people, and And in the outsourcing world, just pure total cost of ownership rather than actual approach. I don't know how many times I've heard the message, well, we've outsourced it, so I don't care how they approach it. But you should.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny because it's a little bit more around this kind of focusing on, and we do a lot of work around outputs versus outcomes as well. So you've got lots of outputs clearly on a program, project, or whatever you're doing, but actually your outcome is what you want. You don't care, to a degree, you don't really care how these things are happening, or as long as they are best of breed, as long as they're innovative, as long as there are these kind of list of controls, if you like, that have set the rails for them to work on. You kind of don't really matter how they bounce between those rails, as long as they give you the outcome you're looking for, with the parameters of don't go crazy and hire a team in India to do your work for you.
Right. I think we've come to the end of the set of questions I pulled on for today. So I think we touched on a lot of things there, whether that be really pushing and engaging your SI to push the boat out when it comes to the technologies they use and the way they're going to reduce your TCO through innovation. I think that was one. Second one was benchmarking. I think that was a big one. Benchmark against best in class, benchmark against what other islands are doing in-house, and do that comparison to see if you can, get that aha moment with the people who need to pay attention to this. And then I think the final one there that we were talking through, just make sure that you're doing it the right way, and that you're just not accepting it, you're not offshoring it for the sake of it, or ignoring how things are achieved, and push for them to be achieved the right way. Any other parting wisdom or anything I've missed there in terms of those that are watching, and if they're trying to take something away? Neil, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think it's a great summary. I think it all comes a little bit down as well to how you build up your culture of support as well. And John spoke about this last time, but having that forward-thinking culture and innovative culture in a support organization is quite rare. And from a leadership perspective, absolutely making sure that everybody is responsible for innovation is an absolute must for all organizations, quite frankly, because otherwise these technology silos will absolutely exist for far too long.
Yeah, I completely agree with that.
Probably two things I'd say to wrap, which is, I think, one, this was a really interesting conversation. I think in particular, the conversation that started this ended up where I suspected it might, which is, we see slightly different pieces of the elephant, and you came along and saying, well, of course it should look like this. And of course, that's our perspective. Of course it should look like that. Unfortunately, it often doesn't. That's the first piece. And I think the second piece, which I think is also really interesting, is it just sort of reminds me how I think executives are blind to the discussion that we're having. I think they have probably no idea of what's going on 3 levels below them. And probably be my call to action for people thinking about that is you probably should, and maybe it's just that act of benchmarking different teams, but you should be aware that there is still a mess out there that where there is pretty high benefit, I think, to clearing up.
Yep. I think that's a fantastic addition to the summaries. Well, listen, Neil, I just want to thank you so much for coming on here and following up what your Twitter interaction with me and John, and having the time to discuss it with us. So that's been fantastic. Neil, where can people find you if they want to learn more about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, so we're on Twitter. So my Twitter handle is NeilHowe1 on Twitter, or LinkedIn is where I normally hang out.
Awesome. And everybody knows at this point where you can find myself and John. I'm Callaghan001. John is Appleby J. You can find us on Twitter, on LinkedIn, on most places. Just find us. We're probably there. Just not Clubhouse. We don't do Clubhouse at the moment, but maybe that'll change. Who knows? Everyone, thank you so much for watching. And
thanks, Jack.
Thanks for coming again, Neil. Thank you, John. See you all next time.
Have a good one. Thanks.
See you, John. Bye-bye. Take care.